a colleague of mine was relaying during a meeting that he'd had an issue with a health and safety inspector. I think it was an environmental health inspector that was insisting that certain guidance was followed. I think the circumstances were something along the lines of it was one of those pools where it doesn't really slot into any of the main descriptors. So it was like a spa pool, but it was large. So it held, I think it was between 40 to 50 cubic meters of water, which is much bigger than a typical spa pool, but it had spa-like features. So it's a bit of a hybrid, and there's more and more of these types of pools that are in operation where it doesn't really slot into any of the main categories. So there are some characteristics of it that are swimming pool like, and some aspects of the same pool are more like a spa, and then some aspects of it are more like a hydrotherapy pool. So there's kind of shared characteristics. And I think the issue was, and I've come across a similar sort of thing myself as well with clients that we've worked with issues being relayed to me where they've had a health and safety inspector insisting that the guidance, for example, on spa pools should be applied rigorously, almost slavishly, to that pool, even though it's not fully a spa pool. So, for example, I think with the issue that I referred to earlier that my colleague was talking about, I think it was the fact that they were insisting that the pool be drained down completely, like a spa pool would be on a regular basis, to be drained down and fully cleaned. I think they might have been recommending that was done every single week. Might be entirely appropriate for a spa pool, but because this wasn't fully a spa pool, the facility had issues with doing that. It wasn't really something that was operationally feasible, and they were at sort of loggerheads with the environmental health officer about the operational viability of being able to drain this pool down on a weekly basis. And what it raises is an issue of, if there is industry guidance available, how should it be interpreted and applied? And what I thought I'd do is try and provide a bit of my own interpretation of this, and give you my professional opinion on a way forward. Because what you need to understand with this, I think, is the fact that there's three sort of levels of, let's say, let's break it down. There's legislation at the top. That's enforceable, obviously. These are comprised of legal duties, and you could be in breach of in breach of them if you don't follow them. So there's legislation at the top. Below that, there are what are referred to as approved codes of practice, and then below that is guidance. So there's kind of three levels to this. Now, following guidance is not compulsory. I think the issue was that the environmental health officer was threatening to take legal action for not following the industry guidance. At least that's what I was being told. But the fact is that a health and safety inspector or an environmental health officer can't take legal action, couldn't even issue an improvement notice, just on the basis of not following industry guidance. There, for example, there has to be a breach in order to issue an improvement notice. There has to be a breach of legislation. That's the top level. With guidance, that's 2 levels down from that. So let me give you an example of the difference between these things. So legislation, I think it's pretty clear what health and safety legislation means. It's basically the law. So you're technically committing a criminal act if you breach any of the health and safety legislation. But there's no health and safety legislation that's specific to pool plant operations, pool water treatment, although there is plenty of health and safety legislation that is applicable, but not in a specific way. There's no such thing as the swimming pool treatment regulations, for example, but there is COSH, the Control of Substance Hazardous to Health regulations. There's guidance as well, HSG 179, the management of health and safety in swimming pools. So let's take a look at what it says in HSG 179. It says, this guidance is issued by the Health and Safety Executive. Following the guidance is not compulsory unless specifically stated, and you are free to take other action. But if you do follow the guidance, you will normally be doing enough to comply with the law. Health and safety inspectors seek to secure compliance with the law and may refer to this guidance. So it makes it quite clear that it's not compulsory. So you are free to take other action. Moving to an example now where we've got legislation and an approved code of practice and guidance all related to the same thing. I want to look at COSH just to provide an example. COSH is the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health regulations. So that's legislation and it's enforceable in law. But then there's also an approved code of practice to those regulations. It's called ACOP L5, the COSH approved code of practice. And in that document it says, this code has been approved by the Health and Safety Executive with the consent of the Secretary of State. It gives practical guidance on how to comply with the law. If you follow the advice, you will be doing enough to comply with the law in respect of those specific matters on which the code gives advice. You may use alternative methods to those set out in the code in order to comply with the law. However, the code has a special legal status. If you are prosecuted for breach of health and safety law, and it is proved that you did not follow the relevant provisions of the code, you will need to show that you've complied with the law in some other way, or a court will find you at fault. So that's an approved code of practice. That's the special legal status. So it's a bit more, it's not full legislation, but it's a step up from mere guidance, let's say. But there's also guidance to the COSH regulations. So the guidance in the same document, the guidance is included in the same document as the approved code of practice for COSH. So it's in ACOP L5. The guidance says, this guidance is issued by the Health and Safety Executive. Following the guidance is not compulsory unless specifically stated, and you are free to take other action. But if you do follow the guidance, you will normally be doing enough to comply with the law. Health and safety inspectors seek to secure compliance with the law and may refer to this guidance. So in the ACOP L5, the way that it lays it out is you've got the actual raw, so to speak, legislation in italics, and then within the same document there's text that's bolded. That's the approved code of practice. So any of the text that's in italics is legislation. Any of the text that's in bold is the approved code of practice. And any of the text that is in normal font is the guidance. And so there's different levels to it. That's what I want to stress, is there's different levels to it. And only the legislation is directly enforceable. So the rest of it is somewhat arguable. So if you don't follow the approved code of practice, even though it's got special legal status, you can do other things, but it would be up to you or your company to mount a defence if, for example, a health and safety inspector is of the opinion that that what you're doing is wrong. But they'd need to argue their case as well. So it's all arguable. And then coming down to guidance, even more so. So you're not held rigidly to the guidance if you want to do other things. And with this particular matter that I started off this discussion with, where you have this difference of opinion, let's say, between management and an environmental health officer. So the environmental health officer is sort of saying, well, this is a spa, so you've got to follow and he might have, he or she might have a reference document from somewhere, because there's lots of official guidance out there on how to safely operate spas. Some of it's produced by the Pool Water Treatment Advisory Group in this document, but there's other publications that are produced by the HSE, and I'm not sure which particular guidance the environmental health officer was looking at, but they were, as I understand it, quite rigid about the fact that this is what it says in the guidance, so this is what you've got to do, or I'm going to, in fact, when the story was relayed to me, they were actually threatening to prosecute, which I found a bit strange. So what does it mean for a manager or a pool operator when it comes to this guidance, when they've got one of these pools? And I've come across it myself. Like I say, I've gone to pools where it doesn't neatly slot into any of the main categories. I've even come across some pools that are called hydro spas. So are they a hydrotherapy pool? Are they a spa pool? Or are they just a swimming pool with some of these features of a spa pool and a hydrotherapy pool? Well, there's all sorts of different configurations that you can get. What it comes down to at the end of the day is a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. That should be your North Star throughout all of this. So, for example, if you've got a pool that's 40 to 50 cubic meters and it's got features that would present the same kind of risk factors that a spa pool would, for example. So it's producing an aerosol, the water is slightly warmer, and certainly anyway well within the range that Legionella can grow. Then you've got a bit of both here. So in my opinion, again, it's perfectly acceptable to say, well, in terms of the risk factors, or in terms of the characteristics of this pool that present risk factors relating to Legionella, we're going to treat it as if it's a spa pool and follow the advice relating to that. So it might be, for example, that you should certainly be getting monthly microbiological tests done anyway, but then for spa pools, they have to supplement those monthly microbiological tests with quarterly tests specific to the Legionella species of bacteria, because the Legionella species of bacteria is not included in the normal, let's say, the standard monthly microbiological tests. But then on other aspects of it, where it comes to, well, do we drain this down and clean it every single week? Well, it's perfectly acceptable to say, well, actually, in that respect, the pool operates more like a small pool than a spa, because what makes it a requirement for spas to drain them down and clean them is the fact that they do get very polluted. There's something called relative pollution, where it's all about the amount of pollution going into a body of water relative to the amount of water that's there. Now, in spa pools, there's a high level of relative pollution, and that can lead to there being a very concentrated amount of contaminants in the water, and a biofilm can build up, and total dissolved solid levels can become high relatively quickly. But if And this is all really down to the fact that there's such a small body of water there. So it's perfectly acceptable to say, well, okay, well, in terms of the water features and the fact that aerosol is being produced, well, we're going to treat that as it like we would a spa. But then in terms of the volume of water that's actually more like a pool than a spa, then it's perfectly acceptable to look at the industry guidance as it relates to swimming pools and say, well, we'll follow that industry guidance, which for a larger swimming pool, there is not the requirement to drain it completely down and give it a full, sort of stripped down and deep clean, so to speak. And in a way, you are mixing and matching, which for certain types of pool is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, as long as it is part of a proper risk assessment. So you can sort of, in your risk assessment, you can justify the actions that you're taking and the control measures that you're taking, because it's a simple reality of the matter that there are certain types of pool that defy a clear categorization. Sometimes it's just not as simple as that. Obviously, if you've got a pool where it's just more clear cut, it's a 25 by 10 meter swimming pool with a deep end and a shallow end, clearly it's a swimming pool, and all of the guidance in a document like that, it shouldn't be any great difficulty applying that guidance as it is without the need to modify it or look at other reference documents. But for some other pools that don't slot into this neat categorization of pools, then it's perfectly reasonable to sort of take guidance and apply industry standards from different areas as you see fit. Obviously, the person that's making these decisions has got to be qualified and competent to do that. They've got to know how to do a risk assessment in the right way. And when you've decided on how you're going to operate, so you've looked at the risk factors, you've put in place your systems and your processes and your procedures, which should all be documented in your NOP and EAP. What you should have in place anyway is a robust system for monitoring and then reviewing those health and safety arrangements that you've put in place. So for example, after 3 months, you could go back and to your risk assessment and review it and say, well, are the actions that we decided to take, are they working? Do we know that they're effective? So for example, going back to the scenario that we've been talking about, you could look at your microbiological reports. Has there been any indicators of unsatisfactory microbiological numbers? You could look at, as another indicator, your levels of TDS, total dissolved solids. You can use your checklists, your cleanliness, and building sort of presentation checklists to visually observe the condition and the rate of fouling, if any, on the surfaces within the pool and on the transfer channels and around the pool itself. So you're not sort of locked in to any particular set of control measures. You should be constantly reviewing and seeking to continually improve anyway. And if after a set period of time, say 3 months, 6 months, whatever, and you review it and you think, well, actually, we've been not emptying, every single week and doing a clean down like you would in a spa. We've been treating it more like it was a pool in that respect. And then you get to the end of 3 months and lo and behold, everything's fine. All of your indicators sort of indicate that there's no issue. Cleanliness is good. All of your microbiological tests are good. TDS levels are good. There's no issues with your chlorine, being able to maintain a sufficient level of chlorine. Then that's kind of proof, or certainly reassurance, that those control measures are absolutely fine and your risk assessment is solid. Sometimes it's just simply a necessity to pick bits of advice. Obviously, any advice and industry guidance that you're using should be authoritative. So it should be either from PewTag or from a recognised training provider or from the HSE themselves, not some obscure blog post you've read somewhere. But as long as it's inputting into a suitable and sufficient risk assessment, I think pool operators can be fairly confident that they are doing things in accordance with the principles and the spirit of good management of health and safety.